Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the final segment of this three-part series. My name is Michael Steinberger. I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit platform dedicated to research, preserve, and most importantly, to promote the legacy of Sefarad. To be clear, the word Sefarad in Hebrew literally means Spain, but historically speaking, and as relating to our work, it refers to the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. To broaden our scope and to expand our reach, we formed a strategic alliance with organizations, institutions, governments, and individuals across the public and private sectors that together create a voice of the collective, thereby amplifying our message. At this time, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the partners that help make today's presentation possible. I would like to thank the Sue and Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies, University of Miami, for helping to actually sponsor this event. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our co-hosting partners for helping promote today's event. I would like to thank Chabura, an educational organization dedicated to the theological dimensions of Sefarad, making them a very interesting and recent partner. A very special shout out and thank you to the Jewish Virtual Library for their amazing support in promoting today's event. Thank you. We are delighted and welcome back the American Sephardic Federation, ASF, a premier institution devoted to safeguarding and celebrating the rich heritage of Sephardic and Mizrahi communities. And of course, I would like to thank our shared hosting partners for their continued support in promoting our online events. And they are the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, also in Miami known as CAGE, the Honor Museum of the Jewish People, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, the Women's International Zionist Organization of Florida, referred to as WITZO, and last but certainly not least, the European Jewish Community Center, operating out of Brussels in Belgium. Thank you one and all. A brief note about today's presentation. Due to time constraints and to maximize today's presentation, we will skip the traditional, the usual Q&A segment and ask that all of you, those of you who have questions, please insert them into the Q&A box. And if you would also leave your email address and we will respond to each and every one of you by email. So now let's get started. At this time, it is my sincere honor and pleasure to introduce today's presenter, my friend and colleague, Dr. Isaac Amon. Dr. Amon is the Director of Academic Research at the Jewish Heritage Alliance and an attorney. He is also a lecturer at Washington University School of Law at St. Louis and was recently named a fellow at the London Center for Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. A grandson of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi immigrants to the United States, Dr. Amon has served as a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague and as an ISIS war crimes investigator. He frequently speaks on the law, anti-Semitism, and Jewish memory, with a particular focus on Inquisition and the Holocaust. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. Let me share my screen. So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to have you here today for part 3 of this series, From Persecution to Renewal. And of course, my focus today is from the Iberian Inquisitions to the U.S. Constitution, how that legacy of the inquisitorial persecution of Sephardic Jews and conversos played a role in the successful drive of the Founding Fathers to enshrine religious freedom in America's governing document. And this is particularly significant, of course, as we enter America's 250th year, culminating with on July 4th, 2026, in just over 8 months. Now, in composing this magnificent tapestry, there are primarily 3 threads that we will go through today. The first is the history and procedure of the Inquisition. The second is the age of enlightenment that really gave voice to the idea of religious toleration and liberty of conscience, and a direct repudiation of the Inquisition. And the third, and of course, the majority of our focus today, will be on the American experiment, both on the colonial period, and particularly in the early Republic. And I hope that you find at the end of this presentation that the surge of anti-Semitism that all Jewish communities around the world are facing today, including in the United States, is directly antithetical to the founding period of the American Republic. Beginning with part one of our threads, the Iberian Inquisitions. There have been 4 Inquisitions in European history. The first is the medieval Inquisition in the 1200s. There was a contemporary Roman model or version that notoriously tried Galileo for heresy in the 1600s. But of course, by far, the version or the model that people know best and most infamously is the Spanish and to a lesser extent, the Portuguese Inquisition, hence the Iberian Inquisitions created in 1478 and 1536, respectively. Now, all Inquisitions are created in order to ferret out and suppress heresy or dissenters from official creeds or dogma, or what is enshrined or canonized as orthodoxy. In the Iberian context, as you may know, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions became pathologically obsessed with a singular type of heresy, certainly in the earliest informative periods of the tribunal's establishment, and that was crypto-Judaism. Over centuries in Spain and then later in Portugal, there were mass and forcible conversions of Jews to Catholicism, and they became known officially by the church and the state as New Christians. Cristianos Nuevos in Spain, Cristãos Novos in Portuguese, conversos, perhaps more neutrally or academically, is the term. And of course, the generally understood today derogatory term marranos, meaning pig or swine. But many of these conversos or new Christians, undoubtedly, certainly in the earliest periods of the Inquisition's establishment, were crypto-Jews, secret Jews. Jews are Catholics who were secretly practicing Jewish rites and rituals. Now, to inquisitors, heresy was a most grievous sin. It put in peril one's immortal soul. And so in order to uncover that heresy, in order to deal with it and to extirpate the heresy, they promulgated extremely detailed legal procedures. And some of the most foundational tools they used were the following. The first is a person was presumed to be guilty upon arrest and denunciation. In stark contrast to our system today, where we have a presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and the state is required to prove each and every element of the case beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases. The second is the proceedings were infamously kept secret from the accused. They were not informed of the charges against them. And lastly, they were never permitted to know the names or identities of the accusers or witnesses against them, let alone a chance to cross-examine them. Officially, this was done to prevent witness tampering or intimidation, but of course, in practice, it precluded any adequate or effective defense. Torture was utilized, though less so than is popularly believed in consciousness. But what is not surprising, perhaps, is that in this system of secrecy and real intimidation, confession became known as the Queen of Proofs. It rapidly rose to the hierarchy, and that is what inquisitors needed in order to absolve one of the heresy. And the end of the inquisitorial process culminates in the so-called Act of Faith, the Grand Auto de Fe, staged in cities around the world where the Inquisitions had a presence. The publicly condemned would be brought forth in ostentatious displays of pomp and pageantry, sometimes before tens of thousands of people. And following this condemnation, which also served to remind the faithful of the dangers of heresy and the hellfire that awaited them if they followed the path of those who were condemned, the accused, as you can see in this image in Lisbon at the Terreiro do Paço, or the Praça de Comercial, would be brought to the outskirts of the city, and they would be burnt alive, burnt at the stake, again, before a multitude of people. The Spanish Inquisition, as aforementioned, had been created in 1478, and so it had already been operating for a decade and a half under the leadership of Tomás de Torquemada when the Alhambra decree came forth, that edict of expulsion expelling all Jews from Spain in 1492. And it's called the Alhambra decree because it was signed by Ferdinand and Isabella in the Alhambra, this citadel and fortress, as you can see, at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada, Spain. And on the right is a copy of the Edict of Expulsion, and it's signed by the king and the queen and some other officials, and it's embossed with the royal seal. And it forever expelled all professing Jews from Spain and their descendants forevermore, in a land that they had lived in for 1,500 to 2,000 years. Now, as we know, where the Jews of Spain went following this cataclysmic decision or catastrophic decision for them with catastrophic consequences, it severed or sundered the unity of Sefarad. But there were at least a handful of Jews who converted to Catholicism and joined the expedition of Christopher Columbus going west. And the foremost name that we know is Luis de Torres, who served as interpreter or translator on that very first voyage that reached the Western Hemisphere in October of 1492. And in a diary at least putatively ascribed to de Torres, he says the exiles descended to the Mediterranean, searching for passage to a new land where they could openly practice Judaism. I was among them, and I agreed to accompany Columbus because I hoped to find Jewish brethren. We were a large group of conversos living in perpetual fear of the Inquisition. And as the map shows, though, the vast majority obviously did not go west, at least not at this point in 1492, but they went across the Mediterranean. As we can see, they went to North Africa, to Morocco, to Algeria, to Tunisia, where they encountered, of course, the existing Jewish communities, the Mizrahi communities. Others went to the Levant, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Egypt, to the land of Israel, to Syria, and on and up into the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, in Izmir and in Istanbul, where my own ancestors went, others to Salonika, and on and up through the Balkans. And that's where the red arrows indicate, and a very sizable contingent as well, led by Don Isaac of Bravanel, the very famous biblical commentator, went to the Italian peninsula. And so again, this sundered the unity of Sefarad and created multiple branches that has never been repaired to this day. Many Jews, half if not more, who sought to preserve their religious identity and not convert to Catholicism to remain in Spain, actually turned west and entered Portugal in 1492. They thought they had found a place of refuge, and yet within 5 years, they too were converted to Catholicism, and they had no option to leave. They were forcibly converted on the orders of King Manuel I of Portugal, who is seen here. And what's more, Manuel went further, closed synagogues and schools, confiscated ritual objects like Torah scrolls and prayer books, and he uplifted cemeteries. And it's, as one Portuguese historian put it, arguably a religiocide, the annihilation of a faith. The aim of this series of actions was to create a society free of Judaism and free of Jewish memory. And it arguably presaged the Nazi project to some extent in the 20th century that, of course, sought to create a world free of Jews, otherwise called genocide. Now, following that mass conversion of Portuguese Jews in later decades and centuries, when they had the opportunity to leave, they fled the Iberian Peninsula, and they went throughout initially the Mediterranean. They joined co-religionists, and as you can see, throughout the Southern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but others primarily went to Northern and Western Europe, to Hamburg, to Amsterdam, and they even led the readmission to London and eventually to the New World. And they came to identify as Hebrews of the Portuguese nation, or Homens do Nassau. In Amsterdam, they arrived as early as the 1590s, and they established a unified Sephardic community in 1639, augmented by a flow of Ashkenazi Jews seeking refuge following the devastating Cossack attacks in the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1648. And the majestic synagogue, or Portuguese synagogue, was constructed in 1675. It survived the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam in World War II, and this year marked its 350th anniversary. In London, Menashe ben Israel, an Amsterdam-based rabbi born a Portuguese converso or new Christian, ended up going to London, met with Oliver Cromwell in the Council of State, and petitioned Cromwell to allow Jews to settle for the first time since they'd been expelled by King Edward I in 1290. And while Cromwell was sympathetic to the petition, he did not officially readmit Jews. However, he allowed them to stay effectively unmolested. And this period of 1656 to 57 marks the beginning of the readmission and the resettlement of a Jewish presence in England. Following the restoration of the monarchy, as Cromwell had succeeded effectively following the abolition of the English monarchy in 1649. So in 1660, following the restoration of the monarchy, King Charles II did not overturn Cromwell's decision. There was no official decision to overturn, and the Jews were permitted to stay. They founded the Spanish and Portuguese community. And in 1663, it's notable that Samuel Pepys, the great diarist, whose diary of 17th century London provides great insight into that time and place, visited the Spanish and Portuguese community on Simchat Torah. It was a rather rowdy and festive occasion, something unknown to him. But tellingly, he makes the observation that they had a prayer for the king in Portuguese as an homage to their Portuguese ancestry as new Christians, and the rest were in Hebrew. In 1701, the community moved to Bevis Marks Lane, to the location it still inhabits to this day. It is the only synagogue in Europe and almost certainly the entire world to have held continuous services for over 300 years. And a couple of years ago, I had the great honor to visit and to meet with the rabbi. And following this journey across the Atlantic into the New World of Portuguese new Christians going and founding communities and synagogues reverting to their ancestral faith and traditions they established throughout the Caribbean and the Atlantic world, beginning in Recife, Brazil, which is the earliest Jewish community in the Americas, going all the way up to Montreal, Canada, again, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And the names of all these synagogues hint at a fervent belief in an ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, certainly free from inquisitorial persecution, because all are variants of the names remnant, hope, dispersed, or salvation of Israel. And as one academic, Studiment Halevi, has noted, Sephardic Jewishness thus literally formed a global circuit. It connected communities around the world, from the Caribbean across the Atlantic to France, to England, to Amsterdam and Hamburg, the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, the Ottoman Empire, even Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. And the cultural coherence that was the result of these multiple and intersecting networks, really based upon familial, social, and commercial ties, underpinned this remarkable capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. Now, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions were, of course, extremely cognizant of this global migration of people that they deemed to be heretics. And unwilling to tolerate it at home, they certainly were not willing to tolerate it abroad. And they established subsidiary tribunals in their overseas colonies. The Spanish created a tribunal in Mexico City to govern Mexico, New Mexico, so the future United States, Panama, and even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean, one in Lima, Peru, to govern Spanish South America, until another one was created in Cartagena, Colombia, to oversee Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean. And the Portuguese established a very ruthless and fanatical tribunal in Goa, India, to oversee the colonies in Africa and Asia, and empowered the bishop in Bahia, serving as the capital of Portuguese Brazil, to identify suspects and extradite them back to Lisbon to stand trial. And this map showcases the extraordinary influence and presence of the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions. Quite literally, they had a presence in every ocean around the world, on 5 continents. And this situation endured for nearly 3.5 centuries. It doesn't mean the Inquisition was always as active in every time and place, but it officially existed in these places. As you can see, from Mexico City to Santiago, Chile, from Cartagena de las Indias to Buenos Aires, across the Atlantic to the coast of Africa, to Luanda, to, Angola and Mozambique, to the shores of the Indian Ocean, into the Strait of Hormuz, to the Indian subcontinent of Goa and Cochin, into Malacca or Manila in the Philippines, and even, it appears, to touch Macau and what is now China. There were very few places where conversos or crypto Jews could find refuge from the long and quite literally worldwide reach of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. Our repugnance, though, ladies and gentlemen, I submit at the end, is not only about this extraordinary global reach of the Inquisition or the sheer shocking numbers of those who were condemned, not only conversos, though again they were that zealous, they were the focus in the very beginning. It's estimated that about 200,000 people stood trial before the Inquisitions, and nearly 1.5 million were hauled before these tribunals in some sort of way, even if short of a full trial. But it's the very essence of the Inquisition that we find most repugnant, to punish deviants from prevailing societal norms and beliefs. It's shocking to our conscience today, but it was to some contemporaries even then. The Inquisition was quite literally the embodiment of what we could call menticide, an organized and bureaucratized state effort to destroy the mind or liberty of conscience. And the greatest movement to condemn this menticide was the Enlightenment, a 17th and 18th century movement devoted to interrelated conceptions, exploring those conceptions between God, reason, nature, and man. A belief that the deity had endowed human beings with rationality and reason to figure out problems of human society, which could lead to increased human happiness and, yes, even human unity. Many of them truly believed that. This sparked widespread intellectual and policy debates across the continent. And in this milieu came increasing calls for respect for religious dissenters, a broader concept of toleration, and even the beginnings or the stirrings of liberty of conscience. And the Inquisition increasingly came to be seen by many as anachronistic, as out of time, out of place, and contrary to the very rights of man, or what we might call human rights. And just a handful of the individuals involved in these discussions, the intellectuals, the philosophers, were John Locke of England, Baruch Spinoza of the Netherlands, himself the child of Portuguese New Christians who had come to Amsterdam before he was born, the famed French philosophers or philosophes, Montesquieu and Voltaire, and the Scottish philosopher David Hume, whose tomb and statue I visited in Edinburgh a few years ago. All of this was but the prelude to the American experiment, to which we will now turn and focus on for the rest of the presentation, bearing in mind this history of inquisitorial persecution, this global migration of conversos and Sephardic Jews, and of course, the establishment, again, eventually, of the American Republic. So beginning with a brief look at the colonial experience, beginning with Rhode Island, Roger Williams was the founder of that colony. Born in London, he fled to Massachusetts Bay Colony at an early age. He clashed with the Puritan establishment over his belief in a strong liberty of conscience, and he fled the colony, coming to a place in 1636, the very same year Harvard University was founded, that he dubbed Providence, because he believed God had saved him to create what he called his lively experiment as a genuine haven for religious freedom. And in 1680, a few short years before his death, he summarized his core ethos in a letter to a friend: "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." As he had put it in one of his works decades earlier, it is against Christianity and civil justice for the civil state to permit to some the freedom of their conscience and worship, but to curb and suppress that of all others. Is not this to set up a Spanish Inquisition in all parts of the world and lead to the speedy destruction of millions of souls? The first Jewish community came with the establishment of Congregation Jeshuat or Yeshuat Israel in Newport in 1658, when 15 families arrived in the city, probably via Barbados. They established a cemetery or burying ground in 1677 that still exists today, and the congregation officially dedicated the Toro Synagogue in 1763, so a century later. And in a firsthand account, Congregationalist minister Ezra Stiles, who later became a president of Yale University, and who actually mandated some of the commencement speakers to create the address in Hebrew, he notes in his diary he attended the dedication, December 2nd, 1763, Friday. It was also Hanukkah that year, the Festival of Religious Liberty. And Stiles says, this dedication that afternoon was the most perfect of the temple kind, perhaps in America, splendidly illuminated, and this could not but raise in the mind a faint idea of the majesty and grandeur of the ancient Jewish worship mentioned in Scripture. In New Amsterdam, the future New York, probably the most famous arrival story of Jews in the future United States, that came in 1654. 23 Jews fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition from Recife, Brazil, where that first openly Jewish community had been established in 1636. They arrived, and the English later captured the colony in 1664, renaming from New Amsterdam to New York. When they sought to disembark at the port, the governor or director general of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant, famously asked the Dutch West India Company not to admit Jews, calling them Christ killers and blasphemers. Traditional anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes overruled by the Dutch West India Company, which controlled the colony. he ordered them to be admitted. He was ordered to admit them and to give them permission to live, trade, and travel, whereupon they founded Congregation Shereth Israel soon thereafter, which is widely viewed as the birth or genesis of American Jewish history. Well, as we know, as the late historian Jacob Rader Marcus indelibly put it, no Jew's ever the first one anywhere. There's always been someone there before. And so the 23 were not the first to actually set foot in New Amsterdam. According to tradition, they were actually met at the port by three probable Ashkenazi Jews, Solomon Peterson, Jacob Bar Simpson, and Asser Levy. And Levy is most significant because a year later, in 1655, he petitioned a municipal court to become a burgher, effectively the right to stand guard and to bear arms to avoid having to pay a tax. And this was a 2-year legal fight during which the 23 actually left. Levy actually prevailed in this fight remarkably and remained. He ended up becoming kosher butcher, a prosperous merchant. He had a family. And when he died in 1682, he is noted as being one of the most significant or notable residents of the city. In Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, what he called his holy experiment, so very similar to Roger Williams' lively experiment, Penn was imprisoned at a very early age in the Tower of London for his dissenting religious opinions. And when urged to recant, he defiantly declared, "My prison shall be my grave before I will budge a jot, for I owe my conscience to no more mortal man." In 1682, his city of brotherly love, better known as Philadelphia, was founded. And in 1701, he issued his own charter of privileges, which effectively acted or operated as the governing charter for many years. And foremost in Penn's mind were the two principles of liberty of conscience and separation of church and state. Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia was founded in 1740 when they acquired land for a cemetery from William Penn's son. And in 1782, the very first building was dedicated, and it's noted that Chaim Solomon, the so-called financier of the American Revolution, working closely with Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance, is noted in the records as having been the largest single contributor. It's also fascinating that Benjamin Franklin himself donated to the synagogue. In Charleston, South Carolina, that colony was created in 1669 when the fundamental constitutions were drafted by none other than John Locke, who himself expressly put in the charter that Jews, heathens, and religious dissenters could settle there. The first Jewish presence appears to have come in 1697 when a few Jewish merchants, we know by name Jacob Mendes, Abraham Avila, and Simon Valentine, petitioned for citizenship, which was actually granted. And a copy of Valentine's petition is seen on the right. It's housed in the South Carolina archives today. By 1749, a large enough community had grown that they established a synagogue, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, KKBE, that still exists today, as you can see on the bottom right. And in 1776, the very year of the birth of the American Republic, that a month after the Declaration of Independence, Francis Salvador, who was actually the first Jew ever elected, it appears, to public office in British North America, he actually was also the first Jew to die in battle on behalf of the American cause. A Sephardic Jew from London, he came believing, again, in the American cause, in the colonies. He died and was actually scalped by Native Americans. And up until 1830, Charleston was the largest Jewish community in the United States. We now arrive at the very last of the original communities in the colonial period. Georgia was the last of the original 13 colonies created by General James Oglethorpe in February of 1733. And only 5 months later, 41 Jews from London arrived, comprised of 33 Portuguese Jews who were former conversos or new Christians, and 8 Ashkenazi Jews or 2 families, the Sheftals and the Minuses, an impressive display of Ashkenazi Sephardi unity. They brought with them a Sefer Torah scroll written on deerskin from pre-1492 Iberia, so from pre-expulsion Spain, the oldest in the United States today, as well as a circumcision box that they proudly retain in their museum. And when the Jews arrived, they found the colony in the grip of epidemic, likely influenza, and significantly, the colony's only physician, Dr. William Cox, had died. Well, fortunately, of the 41 Jews, they had a physician on board, Dr. Samuel Nunez, who had been born in Lisbon as a converso, Diogo Nunez Ribeiro. He was a physician to the king and the Grand Inquisitor himself. In 1703 or so, in his mid-30s, he was actually jailed by the Inquisition on charges of Judaizing, which seems to be quite probable, are practicing Judaism in secret. He and his family were subjected to brutal torture, though his service to the Grand Inquisitor saved his life. In the 1720s, after managing to somewhat rehabilitate himself, he and his family escaped to London. As many Portuguese New Christians did at this point, they openly reverted to normative Judaism. And in 1733, it was he who stopped the epidemic in Savannah, saving the colony. Nonetheless, the trustees in London ordered Oglethorpe not to admit the Jews, to ban them, fearing they would become a public charge or prevent others from investing in the new colony. Oglethorpe defied the trustees, allowed the Jews to stay, and moreover, and extraordinarily significantly, distributed land grants on an equal basis between Jews and non-Jews, as attested to in December of 1733. And some of the names on the grants include, again, this testament to the Sephardi and Ashkenazi mixture of the earliest arrivals. Abraham Minus, Isaac Nunez Enriquez, Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, Benjamin Shefto. This is a photo I took of the original burying ground or cemetery in Savannah, personally gifted by General Oglethorpe to the Jewish community. It said in the original Charter of Georgia, Oglethorpe banned 4 things: Catholics, slavery, rum, and lawyers. The last 3 were overturned after Oglethorpe left. The ban on Catholics was not officially reversed until after the American Revolution. The War of Jenkins' Ear came in 1739, 1742. The Spanish-controlled Florida, technically part of New Spain. Theoretically, the Inquisition had jurisdiction there. Georgia had been created as a buffer zone between the Carolinas and Florida, and so the British under General Oglethorpe fought Spanish Florida, again, called the War of Jenkins' Ear. And at one point in the battles, the Spanish landed troops at St. Simon's Island, a mere 80 miles from the city of Savannah. And as news of this spread throughout the city, the Sephardic Jews, including Dr. Nunez and others who were former conversos, who knew the Inquisition firsthand, fled the city, believing the Inquisitors would come, perhaps auto de fe would be held, and they would be condemned as apostates. The 2 Ashkenazi families, the Sheftals and the Minuses, who of course had never been Catholic or never had a family history of being in Iberia, they remained in order to maintain a Jewish presence in the city. The community only returned en masse in the 1770s during the American Revolution, and Congregation Mikveh Israel of Savannah was chartered officially by the governor in 1790. Oglethorpe, following this war in 1742, returned to London, never again to return to the colony that he had founded. And yet, significantly, he lived to nearly 90 years old, thus living to witness the birth of the American Republic. And when John Adams, who served as America's ambassador to Great Britain, in 1785, Adams personally met with Oglethorpe a few weeks before he died. And according to Adams, Oglethorpe expressed great esteem and regard for the emerging American Republic, which built, again, on his own impressive display of religious toleration, if not outright freedom. Congregation Mikveh Israel is the 3rd oldest congregation in the United States and the oldest in the American South. And again, it proudly retains that 15th century Torah scroll written on deerskin in their museum today. And about 2.5 years ago, for their 290th anniversary, I had the great honor to be a guest speaker. And you can see next to me on that table, at the blue tablecloth underneath the talit, is that 600-year-old Torah scroll written on deerskin that Dr. Nunez and the founders brought with them from London across the Atlantic to Savannah. Half a century later, the American Revolution broke out, as we know. And at the time of the revolution, it's estimated about 2,500 Jews, 2,500 Jews or so, lived throughout the British colonies, the 13 colonies. And of that 2,500, it's estimated that 100 to 150 actually fought in the Continental Army, and 15 became officers, something entirely unprecedented in Western history, because no Jew could become an officer in a European army at this time. The founders of the United States, even in this period of the Revolution, they were men of the Enlightenment. They were influenced by some of the intellectuals and philosophers that we have mentioned. They were informed by them, but their example of establishing a republic dedicated to the Enlightenment ideals, foremost among them liberty of conscience, influenced the world. Europe and the world. The American Revolution was the first concretized example that you could build a society predicated on the values of the Enlightenment. The Declaration of Independence came forth on July 4th, 1776, and the Enlightenment idea of is so self-evident. As it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They truly believed in these ideals. A few months before the Declaration of Independence was signed and adopted and publicized to the new nation, the Virginia Declaration of Rights had been drafted by George Mason, one of the founding fathers. And this document came to influence the Declaration of Independence and later the U.S. Bill of Rights. Why? Because Mason originally wrote that everyone should have the fullest toleration of religious belief to the greatest extent permitted by law. When a very young James Madison, 25 years old, the future father of the Constitution and author of the Bill of Rights, objected and argued for more inclusive language, which was eventually adopted. As he put it, religion can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, the same language that appears in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and all of this is according to the dictates of conscience. Nearly a decade later, following the end of the Revolutionary War, 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States in the Treaty of Paris. Debates still occurred as to the extent of liberty of conscience in the new republic. And the first post-revolutionary test came in Virginia in the General Assembly. There was a proposal to tax all faiths for Christian religious instruction in 1784. James Madison led the opposition in the General Assembly and authored a pamphlet entitled Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. And in extraordinary language, he says, the religion of every man must be left to the conscience of every man. Distant as this bill may be in its present form from the Inquisition, it differs from it only in degree. The one is the first step, the other the last in the career of intolerance. The opposition prevailed, and in January 1786, the Virginia General Assembly went further and adopted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, authored by Thomas Jefferson, who was actually serving as America's ambassador to France. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, begins this landmark document in the history of conscience, and really Western legal thought. Truth is great, will prevail if left to herself. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, but all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion. This meant so much to Thomas Jefferson that an excerpt is actually inscribed on the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. And if you ever get a chance to go and visit the memorial along the Tidal Basin, I highly recommend it. I had a chance to do it a few months ago, and you can see me on the bottom pointing up to that excerpt of that quote from the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Following the passage of the bill through the assembly that Madison shepherded, he excitedly wrote to Jefferson, again then living in Paris, I flatter myself that we have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious project of making laws for the human mind. In 1787, a year later, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, William Penn's city of brotherly love. 55 men from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered. They revised the Articles of Confederation, America's governing document at that time. They had differences in temperament and beliefs, politically, religiously, ideologically, but all of them were genuinely dedicated to seeing the American experiment succeed. And if you look on this famous painting, you can see George Washington as the presiding officer or president of the Constitutional Convention standing up at the very right, and directly underneath his gaze in front of him are Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And notably, again, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are absent because they were serving as ambassadors to London and Paris at this time. At the very end of the Constitutional Convention's deliberations, a very significant moment occurred. The only private petition ever sent to the convention was received, and it was written by one Jonas Phillips, a president of McVisrael of Philadelphia, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a well-known merchant in the city, and he was also the husband of Rebecca Mendez Machado, whose image is also seen here. She was a prominent woman in Jewish life in her own right, and the granddaughter of Dr. Samuel Nunez, who had saved the city of Savannah. And in this petition, Phillips, of course, wrote quite a lengthy letter, but the most pertinent clause, I think, is he says to General Washington and to the delegates, if the convention shall in their wisdom enshrine religious freedom, then the Israelites will think themselves happy to live under a government where all religious societies are on an equal footing. I solicit this favor for myself, my children, and posterity, and for the benefit of all the Israelites through the 13 United States of America. Phillips was actually unaware that the founders had already put a provision in Article 6 of the newly drafted Constitution, which forbade any religious litmus test for public office. As Article 6 explicitly says, or as the clause in Article 6 says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This is an extraordinary moment in Western history, in the history of the Jewish diaspora, because this is in stark contrast even to the British experience, where Jews were largely tolerated. The first openly professing Jew could not take his seat in the House of Commons until 1858, when Lionel de Rothschild was finally permitted to take his seat without having to swear an oath upon the true faith of a Christian. And so the founders in 1787, as part of the original deliberations of the Constitutional Convention, even prior to the adoption of the Bill of Rights, could already envisage a non-Christian, even a Jewish person, as ascending to the highest office in the land, of one day becoming president of the United States. While Phillips was unaware that the delegates had enshrined Article 6 already, or the clause, his letter, though, did presage growing debates in state ratifying conventions as to the need to include a Bill of Rights, to identify explicit rights that remained with the people, that they could see, they could look to, they could cite for support. And at the Virginia State Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry, famous for thundering, "Give me liberty or give me death," declared that without a Bill of Rights, Congress could one day introduce the practice of torturing to extort a confession of the crime. If this happens, we're then lost and undone. At the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, Abraham Holmes wondered if the criminal would be allowed benefit of counsel, to meet his accuser face to face, to confront the witnesses, to have the advantage of cross-examination, all rights that we take for granted today. Without procedural protections, without a Bill of Rights, Holmes predicted that one day courts could become empowered to become like a certain tribunal in Spain, which has long been the disgrace of Christendom. I mean that diabolical institution, the Inquisition. On July 4th, 1788, a magnificent celebration occurred in Philadelphia. This was the very first Independence Day following the ratification of the Constitution. And we have a firsthand account written by Dr. Benjamin Rush, a man of the Enlightenment, a friend of the founders, himself a founder, a friend of Jefferson and Adams, who brought them together in later years to correspond with one another, to preserve their thoughts for posterity. And Dr. Rush has this magnificent observation that the rabbi of the Jews, whom we know to be Jacob Raphael Cohen of Mikveh, Israel, was locked in the arms of the Reverend William White of Christ Church. This was a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution, Article 6, which opens all its power and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but to worthy men of every religion. 80 years later, we have another observation written by an eyewitness to that grand federal procession. And this is Naphtali Phillips, the son of Jonas Phillips and Rebecca Mendez Machado. In 1868, following the Civil War, Phillips recorded that there were a number of tables of that grand federal procession in Philadelphia, loaded with all kinds of provisions. And most significantly, there was a separate table for the Jews who could not partake of the meat from the other tables. There was kosher food. They had a full supply of salmon bread, crackers, almonds, raisins, etc. An extraordinary and quite literally symbolic moment of Jewish integration and civic acceptance in the new republic. Naphtali Phillips married Rachel Satius, the daughter of Moses Satius from Newport, whom we'll briefly mention later. And at age 16, as a young man, he was actually part of the personal escort for George Washington from Philadelphia to New York City in 1789 for the nation's very first presidential inauguration, which occurred on April 30th, 1789 in New York City at Federal Hall in the Wall Street District. Washington took the oath, became America's very first president. 14 clergy were present, including the Reverend Gershom Mendez Satius of Congregation Cherith Israel, the congregation created by the 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil in 1654, and the uncle of Naphtali Phillips. He also significantly became a trustee of Columbia College, one of the only Jewish member serving alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, America's first Chief Justice, and the only Jew ever to serve on the Board of Trustees until U.S. Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo, a century later, himself a descendant of Portuguese New Christians. And if you look at the seal of Columbia University, even today, it very openly has the Tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, the Shem HaMephorish, the most important name of God in Hebrew, at the very top. Again, symbolizing that display that the deity had given light. You can also see it in the Latin underneath. The deity had bestowed light upon human beings to reorder the world according to reason, to figure out the problems of society. Gershom Mendesatius, during the American Revolution, became known as the Patriot Minister. He refused to offer prayers for the British. When the British invaded and occupied New York, he closed the synagogue and eventually came to Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, where he became the Chazan, following which, the end of the Revolutionary War, he returned to New York City as a hero. And just months after offering the benediction at Washington's inauguration, he gave a very special sermon on Thanksgiving in 1789, thanking God for the founders and for the protections of the U.S. Constitution. When he died in 1816, a very laudatory obituary was written describing him as an oracle of consultation to all sects and denominations. No minister ever lived more respected, nor died more universally lamented. He closed a long life in full confidence of the abounding mercy of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's also interesting to note that his son-in-law, Abraham Jonas, who is seen on the bottom left, was the closest friend of Abraham Lincoln. In George Washington's first term as president from 1789 to 1793, about 20 letters or so were sent by the existing Jewish communities as well as various Christian denominations to Washington, asking him his thoughts on the status of religious freedom in early America. Of these 20-odd letters, 3 were sent by the 6 existing Spanish and Portuguese synagogues all along the eastern seaboard. They couldn't agree exactly on who was to go first in a unified letter, and so they splintered, and they sent 3. The first was written by Levi Sheftel, the president or Parnas of Mikveh Israel in Savannah, Georgia, in May of 1790. The second by Moses Satius, so the father-in-law of Naphtali Phillips, from Newport, Moses Satius from Newport, Rhode Island, in August of 1790, the most famous of the letters ever received by Washington in his response, and the joint letter of the remaining 4 congregations, Philadelphia, New York City, Charleston, and Richmond, a newly created community, sent by Manuel Josephson, the president of Mikveh Israel, Philadelphia, in December of 1790. And of these 3 letters, representing the 6 Sephardic, Spanish, and Portuguese synagogues, it is also fascinating that 2 of the 3 presidents were Ashkenazi Jews. Again, a display of that Sephardic Ashkenazi mixture that already existed in the early part of early America. The very first letter sent by Levi Sheftel, the Parnas of Mikveh Israel. He was the half-brother of Mordecai Sheftel, the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the Continental Army, and they were sons of Benjamin Sheftel, one of the original arrivals to Savannah in July of 1733. Levi Sheftel said to Washington, "Your unexampled liberality and philanthropy have dispelled that cloud of bigotry and superstition and enfranchised us with all the privileges and immunities of free citizens." Washington responded, thanking Sheftel for the kind words and imploring the same wonder-working deity to continue to water them with the dew of heaven and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people. The letter from Newport, Rhode Island, again written by Moses Satius, the brother of Gershom. Their grandfather had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. He addressed Washington as, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you. Deprived as we have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but affords to all liberty of conscience." These immortal words were written by Moses Satius. Washington responded, reflecting Satius's terminology. "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, for religious freedom is an inherent natural right The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And lastly, that joint letter, led by Philadelphia's Manuel Josephson, was a bit shorter, again, at the very end of 1790 in December. But he says your sword, right, the military victories of Washington, opened the way to the reign of freedom, but it was not secure until your hand gave birth to the federal Constitution as presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention. When full of years, Josephson concludes, and thou shalt be gathered unto the people, that indelible biblical invocation, the metaphor for passing away, thy name will remain an indelible memorial on our minds, and indeed it has. And this summer, I had the great honor to make the pilgrimage to the tomb of the father of our country at Mount Vernon on an exceptionally hot and humid day and pay my respects. Washington responded, the liberality of sentiment toward each other, which marks every political and religious denomination of men in this country, stands unparalleled in the history of nations. May the same temporal and eternal blessings which you implore for me rest upon your congregations. And this culminates with the adoption of the U.S. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in December of 1791. First and foremost, the First Amendment enshrines liberty of conscience in religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Significantly for religious freedom, there are the two clauses. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the Free Exercise Clause. That same language used in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and it's these two clauses together that, at least in theory, protect religious freedom for all Americans. But if we go on to examine even the other amendments, it prevents the establishment of an inquisition from ever coming to American soil. The Fifth Amendment prohibits compelled or coerced self-incrimination, as well as a prohibition on double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment guarantees right to counsel, a speedy and public trial, and the right to confront witnesses against you. And the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And later Supreme Court decisions explicitly make clear that this would forbid the introduction of the rack or the wheel or other devices employed by the Inquisition. Accordingly, from the very beginning of the American experiment, constitutional protections for freedom of conscience in the accused were placed at the very center of the American political and legal tradition to an extent unprecedented in the history of the Jewish diaspora and indeed in the entire history of the West. And the founders' commitment to religious liberty continued to the end of their lives. In 1818, Mordecai Manuel Noah, who's seen on the left, the grandson of Jonas Phillips, who had written the letter to George Washington, the great-grandson of Dr. Samuel Nunez, who had saved the colony of Savannah, wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, living in retirement at Monticello, saying, the example which our country has set now operates favorably in Europe, and Jews are attaining consequence and distinction abroad. Jefferson responded, persecution of Jews furnishes a remarkable proof of the universal spirit of religious intolerance. Our laws have applied the only antidote to this vice, but more remains to be done, for public opinion erects itself into an inquisition and exercises its office with as much fanaticism as fans the flames of an auto-da-fe. In 1820, 2 years later, Dr. Jacob de la Mata, a prominent physician, a veteran of the War of 1812, dedicated the very first building in Savannah of Congregation Mikveh Israel, and he sent a copy of his dedicatory address to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson responded rather tersely, acknowledging that, again, the American response is what could prevent this type of dissension, the constitutional protections. Madison expounded, the history of the Jews must forever be interesting. The modern part is so little known that every ray of light on the subject has its value. And Madison goes on to note, it is particularly pleasing to observe in the good citizenship of Jews a happy illustration of the safety and success of the American experiment. In 1825, a year and a half before they died, John Adams, America's second president, wrote to Thomas Jefferson, America's third president, saying, we boast that we are so of liberty of conscience in all subjects, and yet in most countries blasphemy is punished by fire at the stake or the rack. I think such law is a great embarrassment to the improvement of the human mind. In 1826, aware he would soon be departing the world of the living, Jefferson wrote his own epitaph and composed his last will and testament. And as you can see on the epitaph, Jefferson wished not to be remembered for any of his political roles, as governor of Virginia, as ambassador to France, as Secretary of State, as Vice President, or even President, he wished to be remembered for three things. The first is the author of the Declaration of Independence. The second is the father of the University of Virginia. And the third is the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. In June 1826, as the new American Republic, or as the young, nascent American Republic prepared to celebrate its great jubilee, its 50th anniversary, letters went out to both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to please provide addresses, to give the grand oration. Both declined on grounds of ill health. They both sent letters. Jefferson wrote this letter to the mayor of Washington, D.C., Roger Waitman, his final letter of his life, on June 24th, 1826, 10 days before July 4th, 1826. And he ruminated upon what the meaning of the revolution was and what the legacy of the Constitution would be to future generations. As he put it, may it be to the world, the revolution, what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst ignorance and superstition. That form which we have substituted, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion or liberty of conscience. All eyes are opening to the rights of man. Let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights. 10 days later, on July 4th, 1826, on that great jubilee, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within hours of each other. Indeed, it's often said, and it seems to be attested to, even by John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, president himself at the time that both men died. John Adams' final words were, "Thomas Jefferson still lives," not knowing that Jefferson had predeceased him by a few hours. A month later, on August 2nd, 1826, to a packed audience at Faneuil Hall in Boston, Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, a U.S. Senator, the greatest orator of the day, gave a stirring eulogy for both men, for both founders. He says, on our 50th anniversary, the great day of national jubilee, in the very hour of public rejoicing, while their own names were on all tongues, Adams and Jefferson took their flight together to the world of spirits. If we had the power, we could not wish to reverse this dispensation of divine providence. No age will come in which the American Revolution will appear less than it is, one of the greatest events in human history. The tears which flow and the honors that are paid when the founders of the Republic die give hope that the Republic itself may be immortal. And thus ended the age, not only of the founders, but of the Inquisition. In 1821, the Portuguese Inquisition had been abolished. On July 4th, 1826, Adams and Jefferson died. 3 weeks later, the final victim of the Inquisition was executed in Spain. Thomas Jefferson did not live to see the end of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was officially abolished by royal edict in July of 1834. And in June of 1836, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the author of the Bill of Rights, the last living founder, died at the age of 85. Again, ending that age, that era, that remarkable epoch in human affairs, bequeathing the accomplishments of the founders to be preserved by future generations. Above all, this commitment to liberty of conscience. A few years before Madison died, and right when the Inquisition was being abolished, Justice Joseph Story, one of the longest-serving justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, explicitly contrasted the Constitution with the Inquisition. As he put it, it was the direct antithesis of the inquisitorial mindset. The First Amendment, Justice Story said, cut off the means of religious persecution, the vice and pest of former ages, and of the subversion of the rights of conscience in matters of religion. And as a result, the Catholic and the Protestant, the Jew and the infidel, may sit down at the common table of the national councils without any inquisition into their faith, our mode of worship. And a century later, in the midst of World War II, when America fought the greatest evil in human history, they drew upon this legacy. Justice Jackson, who served as the chief U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials in 1943, in his most magnificent opinion on the court, explicitly declared in this opinion, or wrote, "Those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics or religion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. This legacy, ladies and gentlemen, is not abstract. It is lived. It is inherited. It is remembered in communities and in families like yours and mine. And as I conclude, I just like briefly, if I may, if you let me, to just share why it's so deeply personal to me. This is my remote ancestor, Moses Simon, on the right. Born in Granada, Spain, and as a young boy, he fled the Edict of Expulsion, the Alhambra Decree in 1492, with his father, Joseph, to the safety of the Ottoman Empire, where Moses rose to become physician to Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history. And that story of expulsion, of exile, of resilience, of reinvention, I think dramatically captures, to a large extent, the journey that we have talked about today and that ethos of resilience. My paternal Sephardi Mizrahi grandparents, of course, my grandfather, of whom I'm named, from Istanbul, who spoke 7 languages, including Ladino, the language of the Spanish exiles, a descendant of Moses Simon, who met Ataturk, and my grandmother from Aleppo and Beirut, who ended up going to Istanbul, marrying my grandfather by the Hakam Bashi, the Turkish chief rabbi, as you can see in their wedding photo, and they moved to Chicago in 1957, in the mid-20th century, with my dad, who was a young boy. And lastly, my Ashkenazi grandparents, of blessed memory. My grandfather, who lived through the Great Depression as a young man, who delivered milk by horse and buggy, who fought in the American Army in World War II, enduring anti-Semitism in his own unit. And my grandmother, who survived a pogrom in Ukraine at the age of 3 by hiding in a barrel of hay, and arrived at Ellis Island in 1922 as a 6-year-old girl with her siblings and parents. These 3 great civilizational strands of the Jewish story, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi, this is the story we have spoken about today, in a sense, from Inquisition to Constitution, from persecution to acceptance. It converged right here in the United States of America. And as we enter America's 250th year, culminating on this coming July 4th, we are surrounded by a host of milestones. The 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials in just a few days, the annual commemoration of Mizrahi Heritage Month, remembering the million Jews from Arab and Islamic lands who were ethnically cleansed and ignominiously expelled, my grandmother's family from Aleppo and Beirut among them. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, remember, this Jewish story, from Inquisition to Constitution, is not only a Jewish story, it is the story of America. It is an eternal rebuke against coercion in every form, particularly in matters of conscience and worship. And above all, it is the defining and still enduring promise of this extraordinary republic. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's in one word. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you for another magnificent, comprehensive, and an amazing discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of Jewish Heritage Alliance, as I typically do at the closing of our events, I once again would like to appeal to all of you to please get involved and make a difference. Jewish Heritage Alliance is a nonprofit that's dedicated to preserving, promoting the legacy of Sefarad. One of the many ways that we fulfill this mission is by delivering amazing events such as the one that you've just seen today. Now, while these events are free to attend, you can imagine that they are not free to produce. So at this time, I would like to ask all of you to please get involved, support our efforts. Please consider making a tax-deductible donation that will help support our work today and always, and I thank you for that. One final note before we go, I'd like to announce the launch of our 2026 educational tour programs. These are unique, specially designed tour programs that are led by academic leaders, and they intend to bring the stories of Sefarad to life. Today, we are going to launch our May Portugal departure, and for the first time, we're offering a $400 early bird discount for reservations received by December 25. Please contact us if you're interested or if you need any more information. In closing, once again, I would like to thank Isaac, Dr. Isaac Amon, for an amazing presentation. Yasher koach to you. And thank you to our audience for your continued interest in the saga of Sefarad. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.